Good evening. Japanese Canadians will remember this as the day when Canada finally moved to right a wrong committed against them 4 decades ago. It was during the Second World War. Thousands of people were forced into internment camps simply because they were of Japanese descent. They've been waiting ever since for an official acknowledgement of the injustice, and today they got it. An apology from the Prime Minister and compensation for their losses. Former internees call it a settlement that heals. Wendy Mesley begins our coverage in Ottawa.
I speak for members on all sides of the House today in offering to Japanese Canadians the formal and sincere apology.
It was the apology Japanese Canadians had waited more than 40 years to hear. In the gallery, they stood and cheered. NDP leader Ed Broadbent, whose first wife's family had been interned, was overcome by emotion as he read from a novel about life in the camps.
I cannot bear the memory. There are some nightmares from which there is no waking.
This was the nightmare. In 1942, several months after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, 22,000 Japanese Canadians were sent to camps in northern British Columbia. Their homes and their livelihoods were taken away. Their families were torn apart. Not one was ever charged with an act of disloyalty. Brian Mulroney promised justice in the 1984 election campaign, but for 4 years, all his government offered was an apology and a fund for the Japanese community, no money for individuals. Then last month, the White House offered Japanese Americans, interned there, compensation. Today, the Canadian government did the same.
Offer symbolic redress payment of $21,000.
All the survivors of the camps, about 13,000, will be eligible for $21,000 each. Those convicted for refusing to go to the camps will have their names cleared. $12 million will go to a Japanese community fund. Another $24 million will go to create a Canadian Race Relations Foundation to make sure this kind of discrimination never happens again. The project will cost almost $300 million, and it came just in time for the election call expected this fall.
So if it happens today, I don't feel any guilt of whether we're being used because it's something that we've struggled for.
It was an emotional day for everyone involved, for the Japanese Canadians and for the politicians.
Today is a historic landmark, not only for our community, but for the whole human rights issue. And thank you.
Wendy Mesley, CBC News, Ottawa.
The internment camps are the events of 40 years ago, but Masui Takashira says she has never been able to forget. She and her husband lost everything they had, a business, property, all the family's heirlooms. Her husband is one of the 9,000 internees who died before they could see today, but she knows he would be happy.
Until he died, he never could forget. He brought the document on the table every day, how much he lost.
Japanese Canadians across the country reacted the same way. For Cisco Miki in Winnipeg, watching her 2 sons, Art and Roy, negotiate this deal with the federal government is the best way the nightmare could end.
I'm so happy that my children were, fighting for it.
Most of the Japanese Canadian internees still live in British Columbia. They came back to this area after they were freed from the camps and started over. This, they say, is what they wanted from the government. The money recognizes that each of them had something stolen. The apology means they can be proud of their past.
We were so tenuous about speaking to the media or speaking to anybody about ourselves as Japanese ancestry. We were ashamed of it. We tried to hide from it. And now I think we're proud of it.
Charles Kadota is one of the early fighters for redress. He always knew he wasn't the enemy.
We're living in a democracy. The redress issue was not an issue of money. It was an issue of justice, of human rights, of citizenship.
No one here pretends that $21,000 each will make up for the millions that were lost, or that an apology will make up for up to 7 hard years in the Kootenays. What they will do, the internees say, is prove to everybody that Japanese Canadians were good Canadians all along. Karen Webb, CBC News, Vancouver.
In Canada's past, a period during which a group of people who only sought to build a better life, were repeatedly and deliberately singled out for unjust treatment. I speak, of course, of the head tax that was imposed on Chinese immigrants to this country, as well as the other restrictive measures that follow. Le Canada que nous connaissons aujourd'hui ne sera pas ce qu'il est sans les efforts des travailleuses et des travailleurs chinois qui ont commencé à arriver au milieu du 19e siècle. Almost exclusively young men, these Chinese immigrants made the difficult decision to leave their families behind in order to pursue opportunities in a country halfway around the world they called Gold Mountain. Beginning in 1881, over 15,000 of these Chinese pioneers became involved in the most important nation-building enterprise in Canadian history, the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. From the shores of the St. Lawrence across the seemingly endless expanses of shield and prairie, climbing the majestic Rockies and cutting through the rugged terrain of British Columbia, this transcontinental link was the ribbon of steel that bound our fledgling country together. It was an engineering feat that was instrumental to the settlement of the West and the subsequent development of the Canadian economy, and one for which the back-breaking toil of Chinese laborers was largely responsible. The conditions under which these men worked were at best harsh and at times impossible. Tragically, some 1,000 Chinese laborers died during the building of the CPR. But in spite of it all, these Chinese immigrants persevered and in doing so helped to ensure the future of this country. But from the moment the railway was completed, Canada turned its back on these men. Beginning with the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885, a head tax of $50 was imposed on Chinese newcomers in an attempt to deter immigration. Not content with the tax's effect, the government subsequently raised the amount to $100 in 1900 and then to $500 in 1903, the equivalent of 2 years' wages. This tax remained in place until 1923, when the government amended the Chinese Immigration Act and effectively banned most Chinese immigrants until 1947. Similar legislation existed in the Dominion of Newfoundland, which also imposed a head tax between 1906 and 1949, when Newfoundland joined Confederation. The Government of Canada recognizes the stigma and exclusion experienced by the Chinese as a result. We acknowledge the high cost of the head tax meant that many family members were left behind in China, never to be reunited, or that families lived apart and in some cases in extreme poverty for years. We also recognize that our failure to truly acknowledge these historical injustices has prevented many in the community from seeing themselves as fully Canadian. Par conséquent, Monsieur le Président, au nom de tous les Canadiens et du gouvernement du Canada, nous présentons des excuses complètes aux Canadiennes et aux Canadiens d'origine chinoise pour la taxe d'entrée, et nous sommes profondément désolés de l'exclusion des immigrants qui a suivi. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, once again, on behalf of the people and government of Canada, we offer a full apology to Chinese Canadians for the head tax and express our deepest sorrow for the subsequent exclusion of Chinese immigrants. Gana Dai Dohi.
For our role in the Komagata Maru incident. More than a century ago, a great injustice took place. On May 23, 1914, a steamship sailed into Burrard Inlet in Vancouver. On board were 376 passengers of Sikh, Muslim, and Hindu origin. Those passengers, like millions of immigrants to Canada before and since, came seeking better lives for their families, greater opportunities, a chance to contribute to their new home. Those passengers chose Canada. And when they arrived here, they were rejected. Ils ont été rejetés parce qu'à l'époque, le gouvernement du Canada a fait adopter une loi sur le passage sans escale. Selon cette loi, seuls les passagers ayant fait un voyage sans interruption.
In other words, people who traveled directly to Canada alone were authorized to land in Canada. This measure prevented or would prevent people from far-off lands like India from coming to Canada, because at the time it was impossible to come directly without having a stopover somewhere along the way. When the Komagata Maru arrived in Canada, only a few passengers were allowed to disembark. Under the legislation, the boat and its passengers were forced to turn around and leave. Members of the community attempted to convince authorities to revisit their decision, but they wouldn't. And on July 23, 1914, 2 months after their arrival, the Komagata Maru and its passengers were escorted from the port by the Canadian Army. They were forced to return to India. 19 passengers were killed and several others were jailed.
Canada does not bear alone the responsibility for every tragic mistake that occurred with the Komagata Maru and its passengers, but Canada's government was, without question, responsible for the laws that prevented these passengers from immigrating peacefully and securely. For that, and for every regrettable consequence that followed, we are sorry. One of the greatest choices a person can make in their life is the choice to serve their fellow citizens. Maybe it's in government, in the military, or in a police force. In whatever capacity one serves, dedicating your life to making Canada, and indeed the world, a better place is a calling of the highest order. Now imagine, if you will, being told that the very country you would willingly lay down your life to defend doesn't want you, doesn't accept you, sees you as defective, sees you as a threat to our national security. Not because you can't do the job, or because you lack patriotism or courage. No, but because of who you are as a person, and because of who your sexual partners are. Now imagine, Mr. Speaker, being subjected to laws, policies, and hiring practices that label you as different, as less than. Imagine having to fight for the basic rights that your peers enjoy over and over again. And imagine being criminalized for who you are. This is the truth for many of the Canadians present in the gallery today, many more listening across the country.
Chief Russell Myers Ross, Chief Francis Lassise, Chief Roy Stump, Chief Otis Guichon Sr., Chief Jimmy Lula, the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes ici ensemble, en présence des chefs de Tsilhqot'in, pour reconnaître les actions perpétrées par les gouvernements du passé contre les Tsilhqot'in et pour exprimer les profonds regrets du gouvernement du Canada pour ces gestes. Today we come together in the presence of the Tsilhqot'in chiefs to fully acknowledge the actions of past governments committed against the Tsilhqot'in people and to express the Government of Canada's profound regret for those actions. We also come together out of recognition and respect for the Tsilhqot'in Nation, a vital partner in Canada's ongoing nation-to-nation effort towards reconciliation. Today, we honor and recognize 6 Chilcotin chiefs, men who were treated and tried as criminals in an era where both the colonial government and the legal process did not respect the inherent rights of the Chilcotin people and the Chilcotin nation.
Defense, the Minister of Canadian Heritage, and the Prime Minister, who appeared to be hiding a bagel in his desk. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has already stained this place with corruption. He does not need to stain it with mustard as well.
Exactly.
Right Honourable Prime Minister, on the same point of order. Order.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, I apologize. It was a chocolate bar, but I apologize. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.